We're now in our 8th seminar. We have 210 Bogrim from our program. Everybody is coming up to me and saying, how's the current seminar? And the answer is the current seminar is great. Let me introduce you to the faculty members of our current seminar. So here's Larry White from George Mason University. And Michael Walker from the Fraser Institute, who created the Economic Freedom of the World Index with Milton Friedman, 25 years ago or something like that? Where's Emily? And Rose. Well, Emily Skarbek, who was in that empty chair from Brown University. Okay, there's we have a very interesting program tonight. The subject is productivity. You know, when I introduced our speaker Sunday night, Alan Feld, and I put up the chart that on regulation, out of 35 OECD countries, Israel is number 34. It's the 34th worst country in regulation in the OECD. Jose Pinheiro said to me, why are you being so negative? You know, why are you talking about all this negative stuff about Israel? I told him it's not negative, it's optimism. You know, I talk about it because we know we can fix it. And that's the good news. So the same thing is true with productivity. The productivity numbers in Israel are shockingly bad, among the worst in the OECD. So I'm not being pessimistic or negative, I'm just being truthful and realistic. And the reason we're talking about it is because we're optimists. We know we can fix it. So the beginning of solving a problem is being aware of it, defining it correctly, and then having the omits to fix it, which is what this is about. We have two superb economists here tonight to talk about this. Danny Ben David, who is founder of the Shoresh Institute, is the former director at the Taub Center, now a professor of economics at University of Tel Aviv, PhD from the University of Chicago. Everything I said right? Michael Sarel, who is the head of the Kohelet Economic Forum, former chief economist of the Ministry of Finance. He's a great enthusiast of the economic prowess of Yair Lapid, right? That's a joke, in case you didn't get it. He's a PhD from Harvard University. We actually had at the last seminar Michael's thesis advisor, Robert Barrow. So Danny will speak first, then Michael will speak. That I'm hoping they don't agree with each other, and they'll have an exchange, and then we'll open for questions.
Okay, thank you very much for having me here this evening. It's an honor, it's a pleasure, and I don't know how much we're going to argue, he and I. Maybe we'll surprise each other in that respect. I would like to start from where you began, basically, in the sense that I'm an optimist. I'm going to show you a dreadful picture, and I don't want you to be too carried away with it, because I think that everything that I'm going to show you is something that we can change. It's something that we created ourselves. Policy determined it, and policy can change it. It's all in our hands. But the default right now is unsustainable. It's, in fact, in my opinion, it's borderline existential in a few decades. So it's not that we can be complacent. I think we have a major problem on our hands. For me, personally, it changed my life. We were discussing this earlier. I never intended to become an expert on Israeli economics. I'm a growth economist. And in fact, that's where we met the first time in a conference in Cambridge on growth. But it was an unexpected, unintentional look at Israeli data for the first time through professional eyes 17 years ago now. that blew me away. Already then, the trajectory was unsustainable. Doesn't mean the sky will collapse in another year or two or even another decade or two. But unsustainable is unsustainable. Demographics are very strong. And things happen eventually if you don't take care of things initially. So let me begin with a graph by Elchanan Helpman from a study that he did many, many years ago. It's based on another study that he did with Koh and Hofmeister. But he wanted to look basically at what are the determinants of productivity growth in the business sector in Israel over a two-decade span. And the conclusion was that it's due primarily to R&D in Israel and R&D abroad and education. And then another 10% due to other sources. So let's take a look at that for a second and see where we are. When we look at R&D, then gross domestic R&D expenditures compared to the OECD countries, actually Korea has overtaken us since, so we're now number 2, but we're still very, very high. We spend a lot of money on research and development in Israel. And to be honest, there is a payoff in many cases. When we look at one aspect of the payoff, when we look at patents by Israel and people from the G7 countries, the leading developed countries, relative to population size, in other words, per capita, then you can see that there was a big gap once upon a time, 3 decades ago. But by the mid-90s, we'd already closed the gap. We'd caught up. And in fact, ever since, we've been moving in tandem with, again, the leading economies of the developed world. In fact, this is per capita. Had I done this relative to GDP, we've surpassed them. We're above them. So we are actually pretty good in that department. Education. Where are we in the education? Well, if you look at the average years per person for prime working age, 35-54, then we have one of the most educated societies in the world. This is a comparison of OECD countries, but there are only 2 above us, and everybody else is below the OECD. So we are really educated. We spend a fortune on R&D, so we must be doing great. Except for one thing. It's not the years in your life that matter, as Abraham Lincoln once said, but the life in your years, okay? So it's not the amount of education that you get, but it's the quality of the education that you get that's important. And here I want to show you something from a study by Rick Anushek and Ludger Westman that shows a relationship between the years of schooling and rates of economic growth. And you can see there's not much of a relationship. There is a positive, somewhat of a positive relationship. But when these 2 authors go in a different direction, the quality of education as measured by scores on international exams in core subjects, then you get a much stronger picture. What matters is what you know, not how much time it takes you to learn it, okay? And that is a key thing in Israel. We are very educated, and we don't necessarily know very much, okay? And that is a big problem. So when we look at productivity, specifically labor productivity, the amount produced per hour, you have to wait a long time until you see Israel. This is all the OECD countries, and basically all the relevant ones are above us. So $41 per hour here. In the US, it's about $68 an hour. Clearly, you're not going to be able to get high wages if you're not producing much in an hour. Okay? Now, not only is it very low, here's what scares the heck out of me, this graph. When we compare Israel to the G7, again, going back to the leading developed world countries, there was a gap in 1970, but look what's happened since. While productivity is rising here, we've been steadily falling further and further behind for 4 decades with no end in sight. Okay? The gap between them and us has grown over 3-fold. That has huge, huge ramifications for a country like Israel. Because what it means is, while there are people who will live here no matter what, money isn't an issue, for many it is. And the bigger the gap between what you can get abroad and what you can get in Israel, you're crossing the threshold of more and more people who may decide not to remain here. Okay? That can end up, this is not sustainable. I don't think we have another 40 years of this graph. So where's it coming from? How could this be? We're so educated, we spend on R&D. Well, there are really two Israels in one here. There is the startup nation Israel of the universities, the high tech, some of the medical sector, and so on, which is it's the startup nation. It's simply phenomenal. It is cutting edge, moving the envelope, and so on. But there's another Israel. And that other Israel is not getting either the tools or the conditions to work in a modern economy. And that other Israel is huge. Not only is it big, but its share in the total is growing. It's like this huge weight on our shoulders that's just pulling everything down, and more so over the years. Part of this, a large part of this, is due to a major shift in national priorities in the 1970s. Moving away from labor productivity, if we look at total factor productivity, which for the non-economists here, that's basically the key to economic growth, to sustainable economic growth. It's the, when you look at the growth in GDP, it's the part that's not explained by more workers and more capital. It's the part that's explained by the quality of the workers, of the capital, of better ways to use them, and so on. It's an intangible, okay? And when you look at total factor productivity in Israel and in the United States, since, well, it's not the birth of Israel, but it's the birth of Israel's statistics, 1950 pretty much, 2 years after independence. So everything here is relative to Israel in 1972, okay? And you can see that there was a huge gap between the US and Israel in total factor productivity in the beginning, which we narrowed, almost closed entirely by the mid-70s. Then came the war, the Yom Kippur War, and we were in a free fall for several years. In the West, there was also a recession, the oil embargo, and so on. And then we moved to the new trajectory, the very, very problematic trajectory that you saw earlier in the labor productivity graph. One that we, again, here too, are falling further and further behind. Something happened to us. Something happened to us in the 70s. And I want to touch upon a few of these. Again, I'm just going to give you a very descriptive talk here, a kind of an overview of where we were, where we are, where we're headed, and so on, and some of the implications of that. So what can cause something like this? It has something to do with infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and human capital infrastructure. If we talk about physical, one area which is vital for productivity is the transportation infrastructure. And here, if we look at the congestion on the roads, relative to small countries in Europe, which are more of a comparable to Israel, I'll show you compared to the entire OECD in a moment. But if we begin with the smaller European countries, the number of vehicles per kilometer road, you can see that by 1970, we actually achieved equality with these countries. Okay, now you guys are young, and my age is going to show here in a moment. But in the 1970s, in this country, in Israel, there's a road still that connects between Tel HaShomer and the Kiryat, and it's called Aluf Sadeh. Aluf Sadeh has traffic lights. After each traffic light, in the 1970s, there was an additional traffic light that told you what speed you should drive so that you could go all the way from Tel HaShomer to the Kiryat without stopping once. Okay, this is Israel 1970, okay? Think about trying to do that today, all right? We attained equality with the small European countries. Now look where we are. We have 3 times the congestion on our roads, and it's steadily increasing, although we are now finally beginning to invest in roads, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what's going on. Now, this is compared to the small European countries. If we compare to the OECD average, it's roughly the same. It's over 3 times the congestion of the OECD. Is it because we have a lot of cars? Do we just like cars? Well, actually, the number of vehicles per capita in Israel is very low. We don't have many cars because they're really expensive, okay? The problem here is that we don't have alternatives to cars. Somebody just forgot to build roads and rail where most of the people live, okay? To give you an idea of how things look in the rail area, the number of passenger kilometers relative to population size, here we were never on the map when compared to the small European countries, not even close. And you can see, in fact, in recent years, there has been an effort here to fix things. But look at the difference. I mean, the increase here in recent years in the small European countries in the same period, their delta, their increase is more than we ever had, okay? It's possible to do things different. It's an issue of national priority. Where does the money go? And where does it not go? I'm not even showing you the freight picture, which is even worse in comparison. So one aspect is the physical capital infrastructure. Another one is the bureaucratic or regulatory environment, which I understand you spoke about quite a bit here over the past few days. If you look at the World Bank's doing business, and they look at several categories, if we compare Israel to basically the same 25 developed countries, where one is the greatest ease or least regulatory environment, then you can see that not in all cases we do badly, but we do pretty badly in most. And in fact, when you compare the overall index, these are the countries, by the way, Israel is right down there. What does it mean in terms of productivity? It means that if you want to do business in Israel, not only do you need people who will create your product, you need what we even have a term for it, right? Macherim. I don't even know how to translate that into English. You need people to help you navigate the system, that they're not producing anything, they just know someone who can help and get you the permit that you need, right? That you're spending money on people that are not really doing anything useful except helping you deal with this, right? This is a problem. It's not the only problem. Again, this isn't a lecture or a class. I'm just jumping from one thing to the other here to give you some kind of an idea where I think much of this slow productivity is coming from. So all of these things definitely contribute. The transportation, I mean, think about it. If I need to move stuff from point A to point B, and if the roads are empty, I need 10 drivers. And if the roads are full, I need 20 drivers. Their labor productivity just fell by half. Very simple, okay? When you look at physical investments, capital investments, and this is per work hour and labor productivity. This is the OECD, or the OECD countries. You can see a very strong relationship between these two. You get what you pay for. If you don't invest much in capital, this is physical capital. In a moment we'll talk about human capital, then you're not going to get much in return, okay? Moving to human capital. So you saw that we study a lot of years, but hey, a year of study in Israel is not exactly a year of study in almost any other developed country, okay? And when you look at the results in core subjects, math, science, and reading, in the most recent PISA exam, okay, and you compare Israel to basically the relevant 25 developed countries, this is the average score in each of these countries, and that's Israel. We're second to last. Now, keep in mind that a whole bunch of people don't even take the exam here. Okay? Haridim, for example. Haridi boys don't even study the material past 8th grade. So they don't take the exam. We can't blame the Haridim on this. This we do on our own. Had they taken the exam, it would be worse. Okay? But this is bad enough. Because what does this mean? It means all these kids... We're a small country. We can't produce all our needs. We don't have economies of scale. We're going to have to be, our children especially, are going to have to compete with all of these children. And this is how each of these countries is preparing their kids for the future. And that's how ours are preparing our kids for the future, to compete with one another. Now, again, this isn't the complete picture because the fastest growing group here isn't even represented. They don't even take the exam, okay? And we'll get back to them in a moment. But if you start dividing up the population here, Jews who are not Haredim, Jews who are not ultra-Orthodox, what is their score on the exam? It's below the median country. It's below half of these countries. Okay? It's not like we're superstars here. We're not. We're not doing well at all. And what kind of an education do we give our Arab children? They do worse than many third world countries. Okay? That's their score. In fact, if you compare Israel's Arab speakers not to the developed world, but to just predominantly Muslim countries, okay? They look really bad even compared to them. That's how we're preparing for the future. Now, how fast is this future going to come? Take a look at the demographics. When you look at first grade last year, this is what it looks like. This is the breakup of the children, where these kids have an average score in core subjects that's below many third world countries. And most of these kids don't even study the material, okay? Now, it's not like the guys in blue here are rocket scientists, okay? Many of them, social periphery, geographic periphery, they're getting a third world education too. Roughly half the kids in Israel today are getting a third world education. And they belong to the fastest growing parts of the population. And that's what begins to make this an existential problem, because we don't live between Finland and Norway. Okay? We live in one really dangerous neighborhood. And if these kids don't get a better education, when they grow up and they're getting a third world education, they're only going to be able to support a third world economy. But a third world economy cannot support a first world army. And without a first world army, we're talking about existential issues here. Okay? This is, in my opinion, one of the most important national security issues that we can talk about in Israel. And it's something that we can change. It's something that you would think would be something that from the far right to the far left everyone should agree on. Because first of all, it's the right thing to do. We still have some of the best universities in the world. That knowledge just should reach the children. We should fix the system, get the knowledge to the children, and get it there tomorrow. So even if that's not your primary concern and demography is your only concern, well, if you improve people's education, it tends to change fertility rates as well. Why is that relevant? Because look how fast things are changing here. We tend, as adults, not to see the picture that's already developing in the schools. And if we take prime working age adults, the breakup of these 4 different groups, and compare it to what's happening in first grade, then you can see the huge differences between just 2 generations here, okay? And if we go back in time to 1980, this was the breakup. And if we go forward in time, according to the Central Bureau of Statistics, this is what it's going to look like. Now, I can almost guarantee you that in 2065, this is not a picture of Israel. It's either going to be a lot more of to one side or a lot less to the other side, because it's not sustainable. So either we get our act together and we give these children a better education so that they can first of all sustain themselves, but also be a part of the cylinders of the engine that we need. The cylinders are there. We're just running on fewer and fewer, and that's why the productivity, one of the major reasons why the productivity looks like it looks. It's in our hands. So to leave Michael time and time for questions later, I want to end with this graph here, which basically, in my opinion, kind of summarizes the whole story in a different way. When I said there are 2 nations in one, this is the graph, okay? This is all the countries that I could find data for, which have data on GDP per capita, in other words, the proxy for living standards, and data on fertility rates. And you can divide them into 3 groups, basically. High-income groups, that would be these countries. These countries, you can see there are pretty big gaps in per capita income, but relatively small families, okay, relatively low fertility rates. The median income countries, clearly by definition they're lower incomes, but they also include countries, some countries at least, with higher fertility rates. And then the huge set here, the biggest by far group, are the very, very poor countries. And this is them. Now, all of the countries, 172 countries, fit really neatly into these three groups. Where's Israel? Which group are we in? What do you think? We're the only country, entire world, that has not yet made up its mind where we belong, okay? In fact, this is the United States up there. If you draw a line from the US through Israel, you reach Eritrea. We're some kind of a weighted average between the US and Eritrea, okay? That's not sustainable. There's a reason why there aren't any other countries out there, okay? We're basically at the bottom end of the developed world in terms of living standards. And we have a lot of kids. Having a lot of kids isn't necessarily a bad thing if they have the skills. Imagine if these kids actually had a good education, where we would be. The sky's the limit, basically, because many of these developed countries are actually getting old. Their fertility rates in some cases are too low, and they're going to have major problems going forward. We have tons of kids. We don't have a kid problem here. Our problem is getting the knowledge to these kids while there's still time to do so. And if we do it, then we'll be fine. And if we don't, get a passport. I don't think that's a situation. I think that we will be okay. I think that we will get our act together. There are many signs of this occurring. It's not happening fast enough, but I think it's occurring. All of the material that I showed you here, you can get on the internet. In fact, I have a few booklets on this stuff, which I left in the car, but I can bring them afterwards if you want. So, Michael, all yours.
Good evening. I think I agree completely with many of Dan's points, and I'm going to elaborate a little more on some of the points, but especially I would use my time to talk about some additional issues which I think affect productivity in Israel quite a lot and were not mentioned by Dan. Maybe because of lack of time, I think it would be reasonable to expect that he also concurs to these conclusions. Okay, so first of all, let me start by saying that the data that we see, this huge gap between Israel and the OECD countries, which widened in the last 10 years or the last 20 years, part of it is due to good reasons. It's not such a bad thing, but actually reflects some positive trends. And the trend that I mean is the huge improvement in the labor markets in Israel, which is completely unmatched by trends in other labor markets in the OECD countries. Okay, in Israel, we had a miracle over the last 15 years. We achieved a huge increase in the participation rate, combined with a sharp decline in unemployment. Okay, so employment increased twice. First, because of the increase in participation, and second, because of the decline in unemployment. And these two trends are quite unique in Israel compared to other countries. In the past, we used to have high unemployment rates and low participation rates. Now we have a higher than average participation rate compared to the OECD countries and an unemployment rate which is one of the lowest in the OECD. Now, what happened over the last 15 years, a lot of people that were not in the labor market before, either were not participating or were unemployed, now they are fully employed in the labor market. Now, who are these people? These are the weakest segments of the labor market. Talking about ultra-Orthodox women and men, and a lot of Arab women who joined the labor market, and a lot of non-ultra-Orthodox Jews who were unemployed. Many of them had very low education and low skills. So 15 years ago, they were not participating or they were unemployed, and now they are working. Now, this is a great thing. It's something to celebrate. But of course, when they join the labor market, when they join the statistics of the productivity in the labor market, they join the labor market at the bottom. So in terms of the distribution of productivity among workers. And therefore, the average is going to decline as a result of this huge amount of new entrants to the labor market. So in this sense, it's a good thing that we have low productivity if it's compensated by higher rates of employment compared to other countries. And especially when we compare it to Western Europe and Southern Europe, especially Southern Europe, I think in Israel we can celebrate the fact that a young person who is willing to work can actually find a job and can work. Because in many of the European countries, young people, especially if they are not skilled and they didn't achieve higher education, it's very difficult for them to find a job, even if they want to work. Okay, so this is one positive thing, and I think all the statistics should be refined a little bit in order to reflect this factor, which is something that we need to take into account and to celebrate it, not to ignore it. And of course, if you adjust for this thing, then the productivity numbers still look bad, but much better than if you don't adjust for this factor. Okay, so after we adjust for this factor, we still have a problem. Labor productivity in Israel is low. And some of the things that Dan mentioned, there is full agreement about them. I will mention one more factor which has some indirect effect of some of the things that Dan was talking about education in particular. I think one of the things that influence productivity in Israel a lot is the legislation regarding labor markets and workers and contracts between workers and employers. And in Israel, we have labor laws which, in contrast to most other developed economies, they don't balance correctly between the rights of the workers on one hand and the rights of the labor unions, and on the other hand, the interests of the consumers and the business sector. Okay? And in most of the Western economies, you have labor unions and you have the right to strike and the right to organize labor, but on the other hand, you have some limitations on the right to strike and the right to organize, which takes into account also the interests of consumers and the business sector. In Israel, there is no such trade-off. Okay? In Israel, the labor laws are completely one-sided, and they give extreme power to the labor unions, and especially, not only they give a lot of power to the labor unions, they give a lot of power to a specific labor union, which is the Histadrut, which is the oldest and most established labor union. I'll just give you a few examples about this. One thing, for example, is in Israel, it's enough to have 1/3 of the workers in the workplace voting to organize as a union. Okay? And you need this 1/3 of workers to decide about it only once, and after that, you don't even need 1/3 of them. Okay? So you can get to very, very funny situations where most of the workers, they don't want to have a union, only 1/3 of them, and after that, even this 1/3 doesn't want it anymore, but still the Histadrut will represent these workers and will negotiate on behalf of the workers with the employer and so on. If a new labor union comes in and says, okay, we can represent the workers better at a lower cost and taking into account also the interests of the employer and so on, and we want to replace the existing labor union, which is usually the Histadrut, the laws and the labor codes will not allow it. They say that this competition between labor unions weakens the workers, and therefore it's important to preserve the monopoly of the Histadrut as the sole representative of the workers. Another thing in Israel, we have the Ottoman status of the Histadrut. I don't know how many of you heard about this term. Why do we call it the Ottoman status? Because it's based on the Ottoman law that existed in Israel when the Ottomans were where Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, and some of the laws regulating organizations were established before 1917, so it's a very old law. And the Histadrut has the status of an Ottoman organization, which means that they are not required to present to have any kind of transparency about income, expenditure, budgets, how do they use the revenues from member fees, what do they do with their assets, how much do they get, for example, in renting these assets to other people and so on. So there's a complete lack of transparency, which allows the Histadrut to have a huge political clout and to exercise this power in order to help their favorite friends and allies. Another thing in Israel, we don't have any limitation on strikes except for the security forces. The security forces, the army and the police are not allowed to strike, but everybody else is allowed to strike, including essential services like electricity, ports, the port authority, the airports. All these businesses can strike, and the amount of damage that they can impose on the economy as a whole, and on the business sector and the consumers is, of course, it's huge. So the Histadrut controls the unions in these strategic areas, the ports, the electricity company, and the airports. And it uses this power not only to achieve very high salaries for the workers in these companies, but also to achieve other political goals of the Histadrut, which means, for example, if the government wants to introduce a reform in the education system and the teacher unions opposes it, then the Histadrut can ask the airport, the union representing the workers at the airport authority, to threat with a strike, in which case the government, of course, will not pursue the reform in the education sector. This kind of strike, it has a term in the literature. It's called the political strike, and in most countries it is forbidden. In Israel, it is completely legal. Okay, so this is another difference. Now, as a result of all these differences, in Israel we have a system where about half of the economy is very badly influenced by low productivity, which is the result of this labor laws and of this strength of the unions and the lack of flexibility on the side of the employers, how many workers to use, how to pay them, and how to allocate them to different jobs. For example, if a manager in the public sector decides that he wants to not to fire, but simply to move a worker from one department to another department, this is an impossible task to achieve. It's impossible. And if he wants to do it, he will have to pay some ransom to the labor unions in order for the labor unions to agree to it. There is almost no possibility to fire workers in the public sector, and not only in the public sector, but in many. Well, in the public sector, of course, as a whole, it's a problem. But the biggest problem, I mentioned, is in the government-owned companies, which are also monopolies in their respective areas. As a result, the public sector, which serves the private sector or the business sector, let's take, for example, the ports. Okay, the ports provide services to the business sector, to the agricultural sector in terms of exports and imports, and to the industry, and to imports of many goods and services. So the service that they will provide will be much more expensive because of the low productivity in these areas. So this by itself increases the cost that importers have to pay for the goods that they import, and the exporters have to pay for the goods that they export. But in addition to this, the government, of course, understands there is a problem of productivity in these strategic areas, and that it wants to, the government wants to have some reform that will increase productivity in the electricity company or in the ports. Okay, according to all studies, let's say between 1/4 and 1/3 of the workers in the electricity company and the ports are completely redundant. You can achieve exactly the same output with about 70% of the existing workers. And everybody agrees to this number, including the workers. Okay, and then the government wants to advance a reform that will encourage 1/3 of the workers to leave their positions and to leave the company, because the existing workers, in order to agree to it, not only want a very nice compensation for the workers that they are leaving, they also want a very nice compensation for the workers that remain, because essentially they can veto this proposal and they can veto the reform. So the cost of implementing this reform is huge, and therefore the government is discussing with the Histadrut and the workers this kind of reforms for the last 20 years, and almost no reform was executed. Now, there is even a higher degree of misuse of this power of the unions in these strategic sectors. When you think about it, the lower the productivity in these sectors and the higher the number of redundant workers, the higher the ransom that the workers can extract in order to agree to a reform. So it is in their own interest to have these companies work or execute their task at the lowest level of productivity possible. The lowest the productivity will be, the more incentive for the government will be to want to reform it, and the higher the price that the government will be willing to pay as a ransom in order to get the union to agree to it. Okay, so this is the situation in many sectors of the Israeli economy. Dan mentioned the education. Okay, and I completely agree with his analysis, except I didn't understand what is the final recommendation. I mean, how do you improve education? Okay, so let's divide it between two areas. One is the ultra-orthodox education, which is I completely agree. I mean, it's completely unsustainable when you combine demographics and the demographic projections of the Central Bureau of Statistics. They are not very speculative. I mean, they are very certain, because most of the people that they project to be between the age of, let's say, 25 and 54, which is the main working ages, most of the people that they project them to work to be at this age in 1950, in 2050 or in 2060, they are already alive today and they are at school today. So it's quite easy to have quite good projections about the composition of the workforce in 2050 or 2060. So when you combine this kind of projections with the quality of education that we have in the ultra-orthodox sector and skills acquired by students that pass through the ultra-orthodox sector, it's clearly unsustainable, and a significant reform has to be made there if we want to have a country that we can live in 2050 and 2060. But then there is the second part of the education problem, which is the non-ultra-orthodox sector, and Dan was mentioned this about not only the Jewish non-ultra-orthodox sector, but also the Arab sector. And then the question, what is the recommendation? Okay, so one possibility is to increase budgets. Okay, to say, okay, we want higher output, let's have higher inputs or higher expenditure by the government. Let's increase the education budget, and therefore we can expect better results. But this brings me back to the previous point of the labor unions and the lack of flexibility and the lack of correlation between the inputs and the outputs because of this lack of flexibility in managing workers. Okay, because when you look at the structure of the workforce in the education sector in Israel and the structure of the wages in this sector, Israel is an outlier compared to almost all other OECD countries except Japan, I think, and maybe Korea, in terms of the seniority premium to the wage of the teachers. Okay, so when you look at the wage of the teachers and how it increases over time, first of all, the slope is very steep. So you have a lot of increase over time, and a big gap in the wages of older teachers compared to younger teachers. Secondly, this is almost the only component of the wage increase of a teacher. Okay, so if a teacher starts to teach when he was young, and usually it's she, so when she was young, but there are some male teachers, but most of them are female. So let's say when a teacher starts to teach when she's young, and she's not fired after 1 or 2 years in the beginning of her career, she'll probably stay in the system for the next 30 years. During these 30 years, the level of her teaching, the effort that she's putting into the job, the suitability to the job and so on, they don't affect her salary in any way. The only thing that affects her salary almost is the seniority, meaning the increase in her age. Okay? Because the unions oppose any change in this, they oppose any flexibility in terms of firing teachers, or on the other hand, giving higher increases to good teachers or to teachers that are considered to be very effective, or that they put a lot of effort in their work and so on. The government is not able to distinguish between good teachers and bad teachers, and to compensate better the good teachers compared to the worst teachers, or to fire the worst teachers. Okay, so so no matter how many funds you'll put into the education budget, the results will be the same, because essentially these funds are not going to reach the final point that we want them to reach, which is the quality of the students that go through this education system. Okay, they will only increase the salaries of the teachers. And how do I know this? Because this is exactly what happened over the last 10 years. There were 2 big reforms, one in 2008 for the elementary schools and one in 2011 for the high schools. And this is exactly what they did. They increased education budgets by a lot, and most of the increase went to increasing the salaries of the teachers. And what is funny, that actually the older teachers, they got a bigger increase in their salary in percentage terms compared to the younger teachers. Okay, so why? Because these were the conditions imposed by the teacher unions when agreeing to these reforms. So essentially, these are the kind of things that we need to do in order to increase the education system as well as the whole public sector in Israel, to increase labor flexibility, to increase the possibility of managers to achieve higher productivity using the workforce that exists. It's not simply increasing the salaries of the workers or increasing the budgets. And I'm not sure that Dan will agree to this, but I think this is the only way to increase productivity in the public sector and the education system. Maybe one final thing about the one thing that Dan mentioned, which is the roads and the congestion in Israel. I think the congestion in Israel is really bad. Okay, and the rate of return to investing in infrastructure and in roads is high. It's probably higher than in other countries because the congestion is so bad. Okay, but when you have, why do you have congestion in the first place? You have congestion because there is excess demand relative to the existing supply of roads. Right? You have a certain amount of roads and you have demand for this road. There is excess demand. Now, how do you address this problem? How do you reduce congestion? Well, again, it's not clear exactly what is the recommendation of Dan, but I think you can do it in 2 ways. One is to increase supply, and the second one, which is not less important, is to reduce demand. It's not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to increase supply to the point of meeting the existing demand. Maybe some of the existing demand is redundant and you can reduce it. For example, by pricing correctly the use of roads. In Israel, we have a system which is completely distorted in terms of, first of all, non-taxing congestion and other externalities imposed by the use of automobiles and vehicles. On the other hand, we have a huge subsidy in terms of providing company cars and especially parking places for cars that employers are driving to their workplace. So I don't want to go into detail about this too much, but we have first to address the demand side and then to see if there is still a gap in terms of congestion and excess demand for roads and transportation. We can increase the budgets and we can increase supply. But my feeling is that Dan and many other people that are talking about the congestion problem and the infrastructure problem, they are only talking about the supply side, ignoring the possibility of reducing redundant demand. Thank you.
The issue of education, is it more money or is it just reform? Well, what we had here, Michael spoke about the reforms that we've had in Israel. We actually haven't had any reforms. We've had comprehensive wage bargaining agreements. It's not a reform. Reform is how do you choose teachers, how do you train teachers, and also how you compensate. What do you teach? What should be in a core curriculum? There are several reasons given for the poor performance. Again, I'm with you, putting the Haredim aside. But in general, why does the system look like it does? One of the reasons it's given is that we have very congested classrooms. Well, aside from the fact that there's an argument or there's a lack of agreement from studies whether that's really a reason for poor grades, because some studies show that it doesn't matter, some studies show that it does. Putting that aside for a moment, classrooms in Israel are very congested. And the question is why? Because the number of kids per class, again, I wish I could show you, the number of kids per class is very high compared to the OECD average, but the number of children, pupils, per teacher, full-time equivalents, is not only identical to the OECD in primary school, it's even lower than the OECD average in secondary school. There's no lack of teachers, okay? It's just how do we allocate them? So it's not just let's get more teachers, we have enough. Then there's the issue, okay, maybe we should invest more time teaching them the stuff, okay? Well, no other country in the developed world teaches children as many school days as Israel. We're 10% beyond number 2 country, Japan. We have more school days than anybody because we have 6 school days, okay? The question is, what do you do during the school day? Forget days, hours, instructional hours, okay? The instructional hours in Israel in core subjects is higher by far than most OECD countries that in the same subjects get much higher grades. Because it's the question of what's going in the class. You just don't throw money at a problem and expect it to fix itself. Again, I wish I could show you that. But you'll have to take my word for it. Then there's the issue of teachers. Why are their wages so low? Well, their wages are very low, monthly wages. In Israel, teachers are very low compared to the monthly wages in the OECD, the average. However, the hours worked by teachers in Israel is even lower compared to the OECD average. So when you do it, instead of wages per month, wages per hour, okay, teachers versus teachers, not even comparing it to other sectors, Israeli teachers actually make more per hour than the average for the OECD. And that's without even correcting for differences in living standards where Israel's living standards are lower. So there's no problem here also in terms of compensation. So when we talk about reform, it's not throwing money at a problem. Again, who are the teachers? Nearly all of them come from teaching colleges, some 24 teaching colleges where the entrance requirements for every single teaching college in Israel are below the entrance requirements for every single academic department in every single university, except for a few in humanities, okay? So while there are some very gifted people who go and teach because of a drive and conviction, and they could do anything and they want to be teachers, that's not the general rule. Most of our teachers could never get accepted to anything in a university. How can they possibly bring our children up to that level? So part of reform here has nothing to do with money. It has to do with the issues that you talk about, unions and things of that nature, for sure. But first of all, begin with a core curriculum. We don't even have a core curriculum. We talk about the Haredim not adopting ours, but the Supreme Court rules it down because we haven't even decided on a core curriculum. What do the kids need to know to go from first grade to second grade to third grade and so on? Not only is it not set, it's not identical across the countries, it's the balagan. Okay? We need to decide what are the important things that people need to study. They don't need 200 Bagrut exams. You can save a lot of money if you narrow it down to a few things that we should be funding, and parents want to fund the rest. Okay, but there are a few things that they need to know, and they need to know them much better. So A is curriculum, core curriculum. Set it and set a good one, and we know how to find out what works and what's important afterwards in the labor market. There's some studies that we did on that. Second, teachers. You want good teachers? Then you have to begin at the beginning. Eliminate all of these teaching colleges. Who needs them? You save money there. You want to be a teacher, go and study something. Study math. Get a math degree. Then at least you know math. Afterwards, get a teaching certificate. Change the order of things. You undergo a screening, first of all, to study something. Now, two good things happen if you study math. I'm just using math as an example, English or whatever. Okay? If you study math, you don't have to become a teacher. You have other options. If we want you to become a teacher, then we have to pay you more. And if we pay you more, then we also can say, and you got to work more. Because if we're going to pay you what you could get elsewhere, then you're going to have to put in a full day's work every day, except for given vacations like everywhere else. Then you need less teachers, okay? Less teachers who work more. You can pay them more, okay? It's not just throwing money at a problem. And the third aspect of a reform here is fix the system. It's a non-transparent system. You couldn't run a grocery store the way the second largest budget in Israel is being spent on education. It's horrendous. We throw money at things we have no idea. They have no idea on how many teacher shortages they have in math and science and reading and so on. No clue. It's completely overloaded. Part of the problems Michael talked about, you can't shift people around, you can't move them around. That's unconscionable. We cannot accept these things as a given, okay? That's where politicians, you want to be a politician? Have the courage to deal with these issues. There may be a cost to transition, to move from one system to the other, buy them out, get rid of whoever you need, and fix it. Fix it from the ground up, not collective wage bargaining agreements and call them reforms. Do real reforms, comprehensive, systemic reform, and fix things, and just go from one area to the other.
Let me ask both of you guys a question, unless I missed something. I'm confused why neither one of you guys are talking about regulation. You know, as I mentioned, Sunday night put up a chart. Out of 35 OECD countries, Israel is number 34 out of 35. Now, one thing, I don't have a doctorate in economics, but this is just seems to be intuitively clear. You know, in the last 10 years in the United States, growth rates have dramatically dropped. And along with the dramatic drop in growth rates has been a dramatic drop in productivity. Now, Michael's old thesis advisor, Robert Barrow, has written about this, and from what I read, he speculates that the dramatic drop in productivity in the United States is due to a dramatic increase in regulation. Israel is a grotesquely regulated economy. So why aren't you guys talking about regulation when you're talking about productivity?
If I will have to decide what are the three main problems affecting, or the main factors affecting the low productivity in Israel, I think one of them is the Haredi education. The Haredi education, this is a huge problem. The second one is the labor unions and the labor laws. And the third one is regulation. I think regulation is one of the three major factors affecting low productivity in Israel. And I can talk about this a lot. I mean, I try to understand why we have such a bad regulation in Israel and what can be done about it. I think the structure of regulation in Israel has to be changed fundamentally. And not only in terms of the regulatory bodies or agencies, but also in terms of the legislation process, which I think is very populist and it has very asymmetric incentives in terms of imposing new regulation. Okay, so everybody agrees there is too much regulation. Regulation has to be reduced, but everybody is very busy increasing the amount of regulation, including the government and the agencies that can impose regulation, and especially in the Knesset, the legislation carried on in the Knesset, not only by the opposition, but also by the coalition members. Essentially, you have no cost in imposing new regulation as an individual in the Knesset or as an agency. You have a huge benefit and no cost. If you are a member of the Knesset and you impose some very, very silly regulation from an economic point of view, but something that sounds more or less right from a populist point of view, then everybody will like you. You'll be invited to TV shows, to radio talk, the press will interview you, will mention your name a lot of times regarding, surrounding this issue. And then if the legislation will pass, you'll be considered a hero, at least of the specific segment of the population that is positively affected by this regulation. One simple example of what I mean is the regulation that was proposed over the last year to introduce rent controls in Israel. This is a regulation that is very silly from an economic point of view. I think there is one of the areas where economists have a complete consensus about the negative impacts of rent controls. But still, most of the press was in favor, most of the population was in favor. It was very dangerous thing. And it got very, very close to impose rent control of the hardest type in Israel. And I think a lot of economists fought very hard against it. And in the end, we managed to reduce the damage done by this and to reduce the scope of this regulation significantly. But you have many, many examples like this in terms of legislation. Also in terms of the agencies that impose regulation, you have a lot of asymmetric incentives. So I'll give you one example, the Ministry of Health. Let's assume that it considers imposing new regulation to increase the font of the letters on the medicine boxes. Okay. This will impose a high cost to the consumers and to the companies and to the business sector and so on. On the other hand, it can maybe save some people from becoming sick because they didn't read carefully the instruction on the packages of the medicines. Now, when the Ministry of Health considers the pros and cons of this new regulation, it doesn't see the cons, only the pros. Okay, the incentives are huge. In order to impose the new regulation, there is no reason why the Ministry of Health should not impose this regulation from his point of view. Okay? And what is needed here is a significant structural change that will change the incentives of the regulatory bodies and also of the legislators in the Knesset and of the government in general in order to create more balanced incentives in order to reduce the number of existing regulation and to reduce the number of new regulation. And I think simply saying that you need to reduce regulation is not enough. I mean, you have to find a way to change the incentives of the people that create too much regulation.
Danny?
I would take this, maybe take the helicopter view for a second on that issue. In the following sense, there are a few problems here. One is the shallowness of the public discourse, okay? I mean, you have basically you're cheerleading Knesset members you get prizes, public prizes in the press if you have you introduce the most laws. I mean, that's not exactly the right incentive, but it has nothing to do with what's useful. But the two main points that I want to make, and I do it very briefly. One is there's a huge disconnect in Israel, much more than anywhere else that I'm familiar with, between achrayut v'samchut, accountability and authority. In other words, I may be a department chairman in the university. I'm responsible for the department achieving certain. I'm accountable for the success and failures of the department. I have no authority to do anything. I can't do anything. I'm dependent on the entire hierarchy above me. And a lot of this has to do with the other problem in Israel, which is highly related, a lack of enforcement. We don't enforce laws. We don't enforce rules. We don't do anything along those lines. And so when you have such lawlessness or rule breaking, biryonim, okay, then you want to create more laws to rein them in. But who are you reining in? You're reining in more and more the people who abide by the laws. And those who are breaking, say, what the hell? I'll just continue with what I'm doing because nobody's going to catch me anyways. I created an amutah, Shoresh, the Shorsh Research Institution. We're inundated with paperwork, and we have to do this for the Rasham and this for the Rasham. When I did research on amutot, I couldn't find on Haredi amutot information of the kind I have to give. I couldn't find anything. These guys continue, and finally maybe somebody shuts them down. They open a new one. In the meantime, everyone who abides by the law is inundated with the paperwork and all the rest. So if you enforce the laws, you don't have to make as many regulations. Let's just start enforcing laws. And maybe things will look a little bit different. But you can't regulate away things that you don't enforce in any event. You're defeating what you're trying to do here.
Okay. Can you stick around for another couple of minutes to take a few questions? Yeah. Okay. Let me hit the students. Go ahead.
My name is Nicky. My question is about the education thesis. So the very successful Israeli high-tech sector and medical industries and academia, the people there, for the most part, are products of the same mediocre or less than mediocre education system as the rest of the economy.
I think I'm doing okay. So is it possible that PISA scores are not actually saying anything and that Israelis are actually managed to be very talented and successful with this education system and that we actually don't need to do anything to change it?
I would turn that question on its head. Just imagine if we did it right, what we would look like. Because what happens is this. First of all, even the best of the best in Israel are getting worse, okay? Again, we have the matriculation exam, Bagruyot, every year, but they're not calibrated. So we have no clue on whether it's getting worse or better over time. No idea, okay? One of the things that makes, so we can only work with anecdotal evidence, but one of the things that makes you concerned about what's happening is that all kinds of ways to improve the grades, okay? Mikud. What does Mikud mean? Okay, I'm talking about my own children who should know it better, okay? They go to high school, their teacher guesses what's going to be on the Mikud at the beginning of the year because last year this and this is it, okay? But the education ministry decided to put something that the teacher didn't think about. My children come home complaining how unfair the system is because now they have to study things that were not in the Mikud. Mikud is to concentrate,
There's no word for
to
this.
focus on specific. Rather than studying everything that you need to study that's part of the curriculum, okay, they don't. Now, what's the downside of that? Then they reach us at the university, okay? And I'm telling you, even the best of the best, I have colleagues in the Technion and I know from Tel Aviv, the best of the best are entering at levels that we have to dumb down some of the first year classes. They end up at the highest level, that's fine. But we have, I know it from, again, from colleagues in other areas as well, especially in the hard sciences, okay? The entry classes know much less. Now, that's problem number one. Problem number two has to do with many of these bogus undergraduate degrees. Because, we talked about regulation, part of the regulation is that everybody now can apply to a graduate school in the university that can basically launder their degrees, okay? And what happens is we have to accept people that have outstanding undergraduate degrees in nothing, okay? And then they come, and you cannot even give them GREs or anything because it's not fair to those who, it's not fair, okay? There is a grandfather clause for business schools that they can give GMATs. But everybody else basically we're tied to a system that we have to accept people because they have high grades. They weren't accepted to the university. They go to some no-name place and study a nothing discipline. And then they come to me for graduate school and they don't know how to solve two equations with two unknowns. And on a reading list, I have stuff in English and they come to me and say, I don't know English, okay? These are people who excel, who have good grades in undergraduate. So you're right about where we are today. I am very fearful about where we'll be in the future because you can add another dimension to this from Michael's old hunting grounds, okay, the finance ministry. We today are more dependent on indirect taxes than most OECD countries, and direct taxes. Eventually, we're probably going to go in the direction of direct taxes because they're more progressive, and that's what developed countries do. In the area of progressive income taxes, okay, half the population pays no income tax. They don't even make it to the bottom rung. 90% of all income tax revenue come from the top 2 deciles. That's today. That's not someday in the future. So all the guys you're talking about in their 20s and 30s don't have to remain in Israel in 30 years' time to stick around and see how much is going to be on their shoulder to carry. And that's what's concerning me, okay? Some people will get by, and some people will do fine. And the university graduates, our graduates in economics, they go to Harvard and Princeton and Chicago. They go to the best places, still. But in economics, so few have returned that the top 2 departments in Israel today combine their graduates program, okay? So if you want to do an MA in economics, part of the course is on Mount Scopus, part in Ramat Aviv. The future is already here in some of these places, because for the past 10 years, most of the leading young economists that graduated in the best schools in America, not returning home. Okay, and you can see it in some other disciplines too. The future is here already in some areas. That's the future for an entire Israel if we don't get our act together in this area.
I'll add only maybe one possible explanation for the success of the high-tech sector in Israel. I mean, some of the things were much discussed, like the influence of the army and the research and development and the aliyah from the former Soviet Union. I think another big difference relates to what I mentioned before, which is the labor unions and the labor laws. I mean, I said that these laws and the labor unions affect most of the Israeli economy. They don't affect the high-tech sector. So the high-tech sector is immune to this. Why? Because it faces international competition. So a sector that faces very tough international competition cannot be very negatively affected by the presence of unions. First of all, there are not many unions there, but even if there will be unions in the high-tech sector, they cannot impose any unreasonable demands because the sector has to compete with international competitors. So the high-tech sector is one example where we don't suffer as a result of these labor laws and the power of the labor unions. You can only imagine what will happen to the other sectors if we can replicate this lack of damage in the high-tech sector, if we can replicate it to many other sectors of the economy.
Another question?
Okay. First of all, I just wanted to say that I agree we shouldn't throw money at the problem because, first of all, after security, the national budget gives the second place to education, and not by a huge gap. It's almost the same money as the security section gets. And also I agree that there are students in the Technion that doesn't know how to calculate a simple equation of fractions. And what I wanted to say that I don't believe that we can pinpoint the problem at the Ministry of Education, because there are reforms that are working around the world. We don't need to reinvent the system. There are the voucher reform that some politicians, even in Israel, want to implicate. But the thing is that even a Ministry of Education wants to make a huge reform. He only have 4 years, probably less, in the job, and these reforms takes time to show results. So what will happen eventually? He will leave his job, someone else will come, change the reform, and that's it. So do you think we can change it without deeply change the political system in Israel? That's my question.
No. Look, I think that the first reform we need, I agree with you completely, is electoral reform. Think about the country that we have. Forget who the prime minister is in terms of the individual. This is a country where the prime minister chooses as his top cabinet ministers people who want to replace him. Their objective function is not to help him look good, but how do we replace him? Okay, think about who's the defense minister, who's the education minister, who's the finance minister. They're all leading parties that want to replace the guy who put them where they are. It can't work to begin with. I mean, it's unsustainable as a first best. Then you have very, very unstable. The moment after you create a government begins the process to tear it all down. Okay, because not only now from the opposition, but all the people who are upset because they didn't receive ministerial positions now want to start tearing things down. In other words, it's an extremely unstable system. I don't know. I'm an economist. I'm not a political scientist. But to take a page from your book, we don't have to invent the wheel here. There are enough other forms of government that are democracies in the world that I'm sure that we can find something that's more stable and works better. But as long as we have a system of the kind that we have, that's like a centrifugal force, okay, then the only thing that I think can get us on the right track is public pressure. And public pressure to get these guys to start working together. And here's something, I can't say it's uniquely Israeli, but it's something that becomes Israeli every once in a while when there's a national defense crisis. Okay, when we pull together, the things I showed you here are existential. They're basically national security. And if that is comprehended, then most of the people, not on the extreme right or extreme left, but most of the people in Israel, I think, would be in a position to tell Netanyahu, you work with Labor. Labor, you work with Netanyahu. Just think of the most recent election. Netanyahu, if he would go with Kahlon, Lapid, and Herzog, they have 2/3 of the Knesset. Okay? But who dreams of that? Herzog, if he would have won, wouldn't have done it either. Okay? It's not a Netanyahu issue here only, but the problem here is us. That we, first and foremost, have to basically force our politicians, our leaders, to start looking at the big picture, to start looking at the national interest rather than at the narrow sectoral interest, to understand that we are here basically on borrowed time. There is a point of no return because the coalition that I just told you about is something we can do today, as weird as it may sound to do it, but in 20, 30 years, forget it. Even that's not going to be possible. There is a democratic point of no return for Israel. If we cross that point, game over. The sky won't fall the next day, it'll fall eventually. And I think there are enough people in Israel that are not willing for that to happen. But we have to understand it before it happens. It's like the boiling frog, put the frog in the boiling water syndrome. Supposedly, I'd never tried it. You put the frog in boiling water, he jumps out. If you put him in cold water, turn up the heat, by the time that poor frog figures out what's going to happen, it's too late. That's this. It's not a war. It's not something that's in our face. Okay? And just to close this off, Aviv, when we used to have foreign ministers and they were actually good, okay? Aviv had a saying, which was later attributed to Churchill, but it's really Aviv, that men and nations tend to choose tend to choose the right option after exhausting all the alternatives, okay? That's Israel. Except that in a war we know that. This is a little bit more subtle, and we have to, that's what this is all about. Getting as many people to become familiar with us, to understand that we're on borrowed time, and that we have to get our act together. If we get our act together, we fix it. If we don't get our act together, we're goners.
Another quick one over here.
If I may ask Professor Ben David, he talked about capital investment and infrastructure, and it's it's common knowledge that we are way behind and we don't really have the money to currently get there. And there's currently a lot of talk about the public-private partnerships. government and companies funding things together and companies getting some of the revenue for many years. And I wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that. Do you think that could partially solve our problem, of how experienced other countries are with it, and are there any downsides we should look out for? That's one thing, and if I may ask Dr. Sarel something as well. You know, he talked about all kinds of reforms that we need to have done, like sometimes a politician says we need to get less people working in the port and the electric company, which doesn't happen a lot, but it happens, or a politician says we need less money for tenured, which actually doesn't really happen at all, but let's say it happens here and there. And there's always a ritual. They say it, there's uproar, they try to force their hand, and then what happens? The companies go to the labor courts. And I mean, you showed demographic charts about, you know, what happens to Charedim and Arabim in the future. I think it's just as scary to look at, you know, how many judges which respect rule of law and property rights there are today and how many there'll be in 30 years. I think that's equally scary when I talk to law students nowadays. And I don't see any way to get past that except for even radical reform in academia, which I'm not sure is possible, just ignoring courts, which is not power I want to give the, you know, authorities. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it was Schleifer, right, at Harvard, when he had a very famous study where he showed that the growth rate of nations is negatively correlated with the percentage of the workforce who are lawyers. So I think in Israel we didn't used to have so many lawyers in the past. I think now we have a lot, and the number is increasing all the time. But on this point, I think I agree completely about the role of regulation. I mean, the more regulation you have, and the more laws you have, the more lawyers you need. And I think especially in the business sector, you have a lot of companies which now have a huge number of lawyers, have a huge department, which its only task is to make sure that it complies with all the regulation it needs to comply with. The more regulation you have, the more lawyers you need to work in these companies in order to comply with the regulation. And maybe there is a lobby of the lawyers in the Knesset to convince the members of the Knesset to impose more and more regulation, because that creates a lot of demand for the labor supply, I guess. But I think again, if regulation will be able to change the system and to have less regulation, then probably we'll also have to we'll be able to afford a smaller number of lawyers. Now, regarding the labor codes that you mentioned, I think I really believe it's a big problem. You know, the structure of the labor codes, and the whole system needs to be reformed. We started to do at Kohelet. We started to do a big study on the labor laws and labor codes, and then it became so big that we concentrated on the labor laws and the labor codes less. But I think it is really a big problem. It's you get some completely unreasonable verdicts at the labor laws. Essentially, they don't function well. The people there, they don't understand economics, they don't understand business, they don't understand consumers. The only thing that they understand is a class struggle in a Marxist way. Okay? This is their approach, and this is the way that they judge in the labor codes, and this system needs to be reformed. I completely agree. Okay, so thank you very much. I'll have to leave it.
I'll just answer quickly and then wrap it up. Without going into the issue that you raised about the transportation infrastructure, the mix between public-private, BOT, and so on, I don't think that's just an accounting issue. I mean, whether it shows up on the books like you're spending it today or you're spending it in the future, put that aside for a moment, because what this really is an issue of national priorities. Is this important? And if so, where do we get the money? Okay? And if it's important, then there are other areas where we're doing things where we shouldn't be doing things. I mean, let's first of all, we need transparency. We don't have a clue when we look at the budget who's getting what. We don't have any idea of the allocation of the money in Israel today. I mean, purportedly the budget is very transparent. You have thousands of budget items. You know, the 8-digit is the takanot. It's very detailed, except that it's not. You cannot sum up. How much are the Haredim getting? Who knows? How much is the West Bank getting? Who knows? But even go to less political issues. How much do we spend per child in the Arab system, in the Haredi system, in the secular system? And who knows? We only know what we know, but there's a whole bunch of other expenditures we don't even have a clue on how they're allocated. So first of all, you need to change national priorities. You first of all have to know what they are, and that means understanding the budget. So that's Koteret number one. The second one is the shadow economy, which we didn't even talk about here, okay? But in Israel, just so we're on the same page, a shadow economy is basically, it's not illegal, it's not drugs, prostitution, and things of that nature. It's legal work that you don't declare, okay, that you don't pay taxes on. And in the US, according to the World Bank, it's single digits, 7-8% of GDP. In Israel, depending on the study, it's between 1/5 and 1/4 of GDP. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, that's hundreds of billions of shekels that we have no clue about, okay? You want money? We talked about enforcement. Get your hands on that, okay? It's not that difficult to do if you impose some law and order into this country.
How do you get this black economy into white economy? What do you do?
Okay, first of all,
more laws?
First of all, move to a system where you have to declare all of your income, rather than having, so you have to sign each year, not make it complicated like in the US, you can do it very simple. I mean, especially if you're beginning. But if you have to sign what your income is, then the fact that you teach and you have your salary, your income tax being deducted from your salary does not clear you to give private lessons in the afternoon and make your money in this black economy, okay? The whole issue of im Kabbalah, bli Kabbalah, we're all partners in this, okay? Whoever concedes that, that's what I'm talking about here, and that's unconscionable. And it has to do with enforcement, because if you sign that this was your income and somebody now looks to see, okay, if this is your income, and makes it clear to you that you're going to get caught, or the chances that you get caught are high, then it will reduce the likelihood of you cheating, okay? That's all you need to do. And the cost of increasing enforcement in this area is peanuts compared to what we would get otherwise, and then you would have a ton of money for the infrastructure, and also to waste on all the other things that we waste for. I mean, I'm being facetious here, but the whole point is getting our act together, okay, in that regard. And here I think that we make life too easy for ourselves by ignoring the transparency issue of where the money's going, enforcement and things of that nature, that all of these things cause, like a tidal wave, they cause other effects here, that we then deal with them instead of the root causes.
Why are you optimistic?
Because I believe in what Abba once said. We do have this, we care about Israel, okay? We're maybe not jingoistic like in other countries, although we're becoming more, so we're not big flag wavers, but we care about this country. We give 3 years of our lives, 2 years of our lives, and if my generation was happy with just doing that, if my generation thought that it was sufficient to go and do the army duty, your generation and the younger generation does shinshin, does other things, and delays. Basically, I mean, if we were all just people that were concerned about our incomes, and the first thing we want to do is start working and start getting income, I think there are many people in this country that really care about the future and what this country looks like. And I think that's a good thing, but it's a question of who can harness that in a direction that's constructive. To get us again, in a war we work together. We don't ask who's right wing, left wing, and so on. This is not a war, but it's existential. And as long as we don't understand that, we won't work together. If we do understand that, then we won't have things like what happened in the Labour Party elections for chairman, where they're each competing with each other, that they won't sit with the Likud in government. Well, what does that mean? You're going to sit with the Haredim then, okay? And you're going to be basically mortgaging our future. There are things that we need to start dealing with, and we need to start dealing with the root causes of these issues, and we need to put it on the table, and we need to start saying them and not be embarrassed to say what are the root issues here, okay? No child, no parent has the right to deprive their child of an education. In any developed country, that's not allowed. Only in Israel can a parent deprive his kid of an education. We permit a group to deprive their sons of anything beyond an 8th grade education. That's unconscionable. Those children have rights, okay? And we need to stand up and say that. And we need to defend these. They can remain Haredim. If you look at the share of Haredim with academic degrees in America, it's double that in Israel, because Haredim have to study a core curriculum. Everywhere in the world, it's not against our religion to study. Okay, Maimonides, Rambam, he was a doctor. The Lubavitcher Rabbi, he was an engineer. Okay? How many of these guys who don't study anything beyond 8th grade can become doctors and engineers? No parent should have the right to deprive their child of that. And that's up to us to say something about that. And while we cannot put parents in jail for depriving their children, because it's too many at this point, we control the budgets. We control the money. And we can say something about that. And we can say, look, if you want to have your schools, we certainly don't need to pay for them. And by the way, have a good time funding your schools if you're not working. Okay? We can control the situation still. We are the majority here. The majority here that cares about the future of Israel. And if they don't get it, I don't really care. We need to care, and that's all that I care about. And if we care, we'll do it. And it's right wing, left wing, we're all in the same boat. And they're in the same boat. It's just that they're trusting somebody who didn't take care of us 70 years ago. Okay?
Okay, Danny, thanks. I'd like to acknowledge Dov Friedberg. Dov Friedberg is here, who makes all this possible, so please, let's okay, this is of course an enormous topic, we could go on, but all good things must come to an end. Thank you.